He fired her like she meant nothing. Now the billionaire CEO wants her back at any cost. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from. And if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The air in the 40th floor boardroom was so cold and sterile it felt scraped clean of oxygen. Lena Hart kept her spine perfectly straight, her hands resting calmly on the leather notebook in her lap, a silent testament to the control she refused to relinquish. Across the vast expanse of a polished mahogany table that reflected the gray Cape Town sky like a dark mirror, Adrian Volkov sat with the stillness of a predator. He was not looking at the meticulously crafted termination paperwork laid out by his human resources director. His ice blue eyes were fixed on her, analytical and utterly devoid of sentiment. He wore a three-piece suit the color of slate, a perfect armor that seemed to absorb the light in the room, making him a figure of shadow and power. He had built this empire, Volkov Holdings, from a formidable family inheritance into a global behemoth, and he had done so by trimming every ounce of fat, by cauterizing every weakness, by treating human assets with the same brutal efficiency as financial ones. Today, Lena was that weakness, a number on a spreadsheet flagged for elimination in the name of shareholder value. The fact that she was the most gifted operations strategist he had ever employed was, in his cold calculus, irrelevant. "Your contributions have been noted, Ms. Hart," he said, his voice a low, resonant timbre that carried across the table with unnerving clarity. It was the same voice that could command a room of 1,000 investors, or, she had heard whispered, instill fear in men who dealt in far more dangerous currencies. "The severance package is generous. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." It was a dismissal so clinical it was a masterpiece of corporate cruelty. He was firing her like she meant nothing, like the past 3 years she had spent architecting the very operational efficiencies that made his company a fortress were a footnote. The lie she told in that moment was one of silence. She did not plead. She did not rage. She did not allow the tremor that started in her core to reach her hands or her voice. She simply held his gaze, her hazel eyes steady, letting him see her composure but not the chasm of betrayal opening beneath it. This job had been her entire life, the stable ground she had built for herself after a lifetime of feeling untethered. He was kicking the foundations out from under her with the detached air of a man swatting a fly. She had warned him, in a confidential report slid across this very table only a month ago, about a latent structural dependency in their supply chain logistics, a single point of failure that was invisible to everyone but her. He had dismissed it as a low-probability risk, his focus already on the quarterly earnings report. Now, as he slid her life into a manila envelope, that unheeded warning felt like a phantom limb, an ache for what he was about to lose and did not even realize. She rose, smoothed down the front of her pencil skirt, and walked out of the room without a backward glance, the steady click of her low heels on the marble floor the only sound she allowed herself to make. 5 months later, the world had shifted on its axis. Lena had poured her severance and her savings into a small, 2-room office in a less glamorous part of the city, founding Hart Strategy and Solutions. She worked with small to medium-sized businesses, untangling their operational knots, building them from the ground up with the same ferocious intelligence she had once devoted to Volkov Holdings. It was smaller, quieter, and safer. She was in control. Meanwhile, across the city, Adrian Volkov's fortress was cracking. The hostile takeover bid had come out of nowhere, a shark slicing through the placid waters of the market. A rival entity, Sokolov Industries, led by the enigmatic and ruthless Dmitry Sokolov, was buying up stock, launching proxy fights, and systematically exploiting a cascade of logistical failures that were bleeding Volkov Holdings dry. The failures all stemmed from one single point of weakness, the very one Lena had identified. Her carefully constructed models and contingency plans, discarded after her departure, had been the only thing shoring up the vulnerability. Without her, the weakness became a gaping wound, and Dmitry Sokolov was pouring salt into it with surgical precision. Adrian sat in that same 40th floor boardroom, the city lights glittering below like a carpet of fallen stars, and for the first time in his life, he felt the cold touch of impending failure. His board was panicked, his executives were useless, and every solution they proposed was a flimsy bandage on a mortal wound. And in the center of the storm, one name echoed in his mind: Lena Hart. He had cut her out like a cancer, but now he realized he had excised the one organ that had been keeping the entire body alive. He had fired her like she was nothing, and now she was everything. The realization was a shard of ice in his gut. Finding her was no longer a matter of pride. It was a matter of survival. He found her on a Tuesday evening, working late under the fluorescent glow of her new office. The knock on her door was firm, decisive, and she knew who it was before she even saw him. When she opened it, he filled the frame, his sheer size and presence seeming to shrink the small room. He looked different than he had in the boardroom. The perfect, untouchable armor of his suit was still there, but a darkness swirled in his ice-blue eyes, a tension in his broad shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and a battle being lost. He took in her space, the whiteboard covered in complex diagrams, the neat stacks of files, the quiet competence of it all, and a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Lena leaned against the door jamb, her arms crossed, her expression a carefully constructed wall of neutrality. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her surprise or her anger. She had grieved the loss of her career at his company, and from that grief, she had forged a new independence he had no right to disturb. "Mr. Volkov," she said, her voice cool and even, "to what do I owe the unexpected pleasure? I believe our business concluded 5 months ago." He stepped inside without being invited, the scent of expensive cologne and cold night air filling her small office. He stopped in the center of the room, turning to face her, the scar on his left knuckle a pale white line against his skin. "I made a mistake," he said, the words sounding as if they were being pulled from him under duress. "A catastrophic one. Sokolov Industries is gutting my company from the inside out, using a vulnerability you warned me about. I need you back, Lena, and I will pay whatever it takes." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy and glittering with temptation and the bitter taste of irony. This was the moment she had fantasized about in her darkest hours, the great Adrian Volkov, brought to his knees, admitting his error. But seeing him here, the raw desperation warring with his innate arrogance, she felt not triumph, but a dangerous, unsettling pull. She saw the empire builder, the ruthless CEO, but for a fleeting instant, she also saw a cornered animal, and that was a far more perilous thing. She could say no, could savor the victory of watching his empire burn from the ashes of his own hubris. Or she could step back into the fire with him, not as an employee to be dismissed, but as the indispensable asset she had always been. The choice would define her, and the weight of it settled upon her as his intense gaze held hers, a silent promise of power, danger, and a reckoning that had been 5 months in the making. He was offering her a blank check to fix the mess he had created, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the true cost would be far higher than money. She would demand his public humiliation, his professional concession, but what he was truly offering, what he was demanding in return, was a piece of herself she had fought so hard to reclaim. Lena let the silence stretch, a weapon she had learned to wield in boardrooms dominated by powerful men. She watched Adrian Volkov, letting him stand in the center of her new, self-made world, a world he had inadvertently forced her to create. She saw the impatience flickering at the edges of his formidable control, the slight tightening of his jaw that betrayed the immense pressure he was under. He was a man accustomed to immediate capitulation, to having his orders followed without question, and her quiet refusal to be overwhelmed was a language he understood as defiance. Finally, she pushed off the door jamb and walked to her desk, creating a barrier between them, however small. She needed the solid feel of the wood beneath her fingertips to ground her. "What you are asking for is not a simple consultation, Mr. Volkov," she began, her tone measured and professional, as if he were any other potential client and not the man who had unceremoniously dismantled her life. "You are describing a corporate war. You need a general, not just an advisor, and you fired your best one." The barb landed. She saw it in the almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes. He did not apologize, not yet. Pride was a part of his DNA, as essential as bone and blood. Instead, he moved to the offensive, laying out his terms with a brutal clarity that was meant to overwhelm her. "I am offering you a position as senior strategic advisor to the CEO, with full autonomy over the operational defense of the company." he stated, his voice dropping to a low, persuasive pitch. Your salary will be triple what it was. You will be granted a 2% equity stake in Volkov Holdings, vested immediately, and I will move you into the penthouse suite of my residential tower, for security and to ensure we can work at any hour without impediment. He laid out the terms like a king bestowing treasures upon a subject, but Lena heard the unspoken meaning behind each clause. The salary and equity were bait, a golden lure she was meant to find irresistible. But the penthouse, that was the cage. It was about control, about keeping her close, his most valuable asset now locked away where he could monitor her. It was a deal wrapped in dominance, an offer of protection that felt dangerously close to possession. She felt a cold fury mix with a hot, unwilling spark of intrigue. He was breathtaking in his arrogance, so certain that his world of wealth and power was a thing no one could refuse. He expected her to be grateful, to be dazzled. He had miscalculated again. Your offer is insufficient, she said calmly, picking up a pen from her desk and turning it over in her fingers. He stilled, genuinely taken aback. It was likely the first time in years anyone had said those words to him. The money is irrelevant, the equity is a start, but none of it addresses the core issue. She looked up, her hazel eyes locking with his. You publicly humiliated me. Your entire executive team watched as I was escorted from the building like a common criminal who had stolen office supplies. My professional reputation took a hit from which I have only just begun to recover. You did not just fire me, Mr. Volkov. You tried to erase me. If I am to return, it will be on my terms, and they are not negotiable. She took a breath, the air in the small office thick with tension. First, you will issue a formal company-wide memo, with a copy sent to the major financial news outlets, stating that my termination was an error in executive judgment. You will state that I have been brought back to rectify a critical oversight, and that I have your complete and unconditional authority. It will be, in effect, a public apology. A muscle jumped in Adrian's jaw. Publicly admitting a mistake was anathema to him, an admission of weakness he could not afford, especially not now. Second, Lena continued, pressing her advantage, I will not be your employee. I will be engaged as an outside contractor through my own firm. Volkov Holdings will be my client. It is a matter of structure and of principle. And third, I will not be living in your gilded cage. I will work from your headquarters, but I will go home to my own apartment at the end of the day. A long moment passed. Adrian walked to the window of her small office, looking down at the streetlights below, his back to her. The sheer breadth of his shoulders and the tailored suit blocked out a significant portion of the view. He was a man wrestling with the unfamiliar sensation of being outmaneuvered. He had come here expecting to write a check and claim his prize. He had not expected to be forced to barter with his pride, the one currency he valued above all others. When he turned back, his face was a cold, unreadable mask, but his eyes burned with a new kind of intensity. It was not just desperation anymore. It was respect, grudging and sharp, and something else, something darker and more proprietary. It was the look of a man who has found a rare, invaluable object he is determined to possess, regardless of the cost. The public apology will be on every desk and in every inbox by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, he conceded, his voice raspy. Your firm will be retained. I accept your first 2 terms. He took a step closer, his presence once again dominating the space between them. But the third is non-negotiable. Sokolov is not just a corporate raider. He plays dirty. The threats are not just to the company. They will extend to anyone he perceives as essential to my defense. That is now you. You will be his primary target. My penthouse has a dedicated security team, biometric access, and is impenetrable. Your apartment is a liability I will not permit. You will stay with me. This is not for my convenience, Ms. Hart. It is for your protection. His argument was logical, infuriatingly so. He was using the very danger he had dragged her into as a justification for controlling her. The line between protection and possession was blurring into non-existence. She felt the magnetic pull of his world, a vortex of high-stakes power, wealth, and a danger that was perversely alluring. It was everything she had run from and everything she had secretly excelled at navigating. To be in the center of that storm again, not as a subordinate but as a key player, was a temptation that went far beyond money. It was about vindication. It was about proving to him and to herself that she was not disposable. She looked into his ice-blue eyes and saw the unyielding certainty of a man who would get what he wanted, one way or another. He would not walk away. He had asserted his dominance, not through threats, but through an undeniable, terrifying logic. Resisting him felt futile, but more than that, a small, treacherous part of her did not want to resist. "Fine," she said, the word clipped. "I will stay at your penthouse. But be clear about this, Mr. Volkov. I am there to win a war for my client. This is a business arrangement, nothing more." A slow ghost of a smile touched his lips, a chillingly confident expression that did not reach his eyes. "Of course, Lena," he murmured, using her first name for the first time, the sound of it from his lips a possessive claim. "Purely business." Next day, Lena walked back into the gleaming glass headquarters of Volkov Holdings not as a disgraced ex-employee, but as a conqueror. The memo had, as promised, been circulated. The whispers fell silent as she passed. The stairs were a mixture of awe, confusion, and fear. She went directly to the 40th floor, to the office next to Adrian's, a space that had been hastily prepared for her. It was vast and minimalist, with a floor-to-ceiling window offering a panoramic view of Table Mountain. Adrian was waiting for her, standing by the window. He turned as she entered, and for a moment they just looked at each other, the new terms of their engagement settling between them. The power dynamic had been irrevocably altered. She was no longer just an employee he could fire. She was the linchpin holding his empire together, and they both knew it. That night, she packed a small bag and was driven in one of Adrian's black sedans to his residential tower on the waterfront. The penthouse was a sprawling, opulent space of glass, steel, and marble, with breathtaking views of the harbor. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly isolating. Her rooms were in a separate wing, luxurious and private, but the entire place hummed with the quiet presence of his security detail. It was a fortress, and as the doors slid shut behind her, she felt the unmistakable sensation of a cage, however gilded, closing around her. The temptation of his world was real. The power, the intellectual challenge, the intoxicating proximity to him. But so was the danger, not just from his enemies, but from the man himself, who watched her now with an obsessive focus that promised to consume everything. The first week was a maelstrom of data analysis and strategic warfare. Lena worked with a relentless, focused energy, diving deep into the company's infrastructure, her mind a whirlwind of algorithms and predictive models. She and Adrian spent 18 hours a day together, huddled over glowing screens in his penthouse study, or commanding the silent, tense atmosphere of the midnight boardroom. They operated in a state of heightened intimacy born of shared crisis, their conversations a rapid-fire exchange of ideas, arguments, and strategies. Lena quickly proved that her value was incalculable. She not only plugged the holes Dmitry Sokolov was exploiting, but began to anticipate his moves, setting digital traps and launching corporate counteroffensives that left the rival company reeling. She was a master strategist, and in the heat of battle, the animosity between her and Adrian was forged into a grudging, powerful respect. He gave her the unconditional authority he had promised, overriding his own panicked board members to implement her most audacious plans. He watched her, his gaze a constant weight on her skin, a mixture of awe at her intellect and a raw, possessive intensity that simmered just beneath the surface of his icy control. The attack, when it came, was not aimed at the company's servers. It was aimed at her. Lena was working late in the penthouse study, a cup of tea growing cold beside her when a file appeared on her encrypted laptop. It had not come through any official channel. It was simply there. Her name was the file's title, Lena Hart A. Study. With a tremor of dread, she opened it. Inside was a meticulously compiled dossier on her life. Her estranged parents, her academic records, her previous addresses, even the name of a man she had dated briefly in university. It was a violation, a clear message from Dmitry Sokolov that he knew who she was, that she was no longer a faceless strategist but a person with vulnerabilities he could exploit. The blood drained from her face. Adrian found her moments later, her hands clenched on the edge of the desk, her face a mask of pale shock. He saw the open file on her screen, and a rage so cold and absolute transformed his features that for a second he looked like a stranger, a man capable of truly terrifying violence. He didn't speak. He simply closed the laptop, his movements precise and deadly, and then he turned to his head of security, a grim-faced man named Marco who was always a shadow at his side. Find out how he got this, Adrian ordered, his voice lethally soft. And find out everything there is to know about where Dmitry Sokolov sleeps, eats, and breathes. Later that night, after Marco and his team had swept the penthouse for listening devices and digital backdoors, Adrian found Lena staring out at the harbor lights, her arms wrapped around herself. The illusion of safety had been shattered. The gilded cage was no protection if the enemy could slip through the bars. He came to stand beside her, the silence between them heavy with unspoken questions. "He will not touch you again," Adrian said, his voice a low vow. "I will kill him before I let him lay a hand on you." The words were not a comfort. They were a confirmation of the world she was now in, a world where murder was a viable solution to a business problem. "This isn't just about the company, is it?" she asked quietly, not looking at him. "Who is Dmitry Sokolov to you?" Adrian was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the dark water. The reflection in the glass showed a man burdened by more than a hostile takeover. It showed the weight of a legacy she was only just beginning to understand. "Volkov Holdings is more than a corporation," he finally began, his voice rough with a truth he rarely spoke aloud. "It is the legitimate face of my family's organization. My grandfather built an empire in the shadows after arriving here with nothing. My father legitimized it, moved it into boardrooms and stock markets. But the old world, the old rules, they do not simply disappear." He turned to face her, his ice-blue eyes searching hers, demanding she understand. "The Volkovs and the Sokolovs have been rivals for generations, back in the old country. Blood has been shed. When my father died, I inherited it all, the CEO title and the responsibility as head of the family. The syndicate. I have tried to keep the two worlds separate, to build something clean. But Dmitry sees this as weakness. He doesn't want to take over my company. He wants to burn my entire world to the ground and reclaim what he believes is his family's rightful place." He held up his left hand, turning it over so she could see the pale, jagged scar across the knuckles. "I got this when I was 18. It was a loyalty oath. A promise sealed in blood that I would always protect the family, that I would always put its interests first. For years, I believed that meant growing the company, making us untouchable in the legitimate world. Dmitry is reminding me that our history is written in a different language." It was a confession, a baring of the soul from a man who hid behind walls of ice and steel. He was showing her the wound at the core of his being, the impossible schism between the polished, ruthless CEO and the syndicate heir bound by blood oaths and ancient rivalries. In his vulnerability, she felt an unexpected echo of her own. His burden was one of history and violence. Hers was one of proving her worth. But they were both driven by a deep, fundamental need to protect what they had built. "My entire life," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I have been fighting to be seen, my family. They are academics. They value theory, not application. My choice to go into business was seen as a lesser path. Every success, every promotion was about proving to them and to myself that I was not a failure, that what I built with my mind had value." She finally looked at him, her gaze clear and direct. "When you fired me, you confirmed their judgment. You made me feel like all of it, all the work, all the sacrifice, meant nothing." The admission hung between them, a fragile bridge of shared pain. He saw her then, not just as a brilliant strategist or a tool for his salvation, but as a woman who had been wounded in a way he was only just beginning to comprehend. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed a stray coil of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark in the pressurized atmosphere of the room. It was not the touch of a boss or a client. It was something far more intimate, far more dangerous. In that moment, the war with Dmitry Sokolov faded to a distant drumbeat, and the only battle that mattered was the one raging within the four glass walls of the penthouse, a struggle between two powerful, wounded souls who had found in each other a reflection they could not turn away from. The confession changed everything. The professional boundaries they had so carefully constructed dissolved in the wake of their shared vulnerability, leaving behind a raw and potent intimacy. They continued to work with the same relentless drive, but now a new current flowed between them, an undercurrent of awareness that was both thrilling and terrifying. The long nights spent strategizing were no longer just about saving the company. They were about protecting each other, about shoring up the defenses of a world that was becoming theirs together. The war with Dmitry Sokolov had become intensely personal. He was no longer just attacking Volkov Holdings. He was attacking Adrian and Lena. The moment of surrender happened on a rain-lashed night, nearly 3 weeks into their siege. They had just thwarted a massive, coordinated digital assault on the company's financial infrastructure, a complex attack that had required their combined genius to dismantle. Exhaustion hung heavy in the air of the penthouse study, mingled with the heady scent of victory. The city below was a blur of shimmering lights through the rain-streaked glass. Lena was slumped in her chair, her head in her hands, the adrenaline finally seeping away to leave a deep, bone-weary fatigue. Adrian stood behind her, his hand resting on the back of her chair. He had been there for the last hour, a silent, solid presence at her back as she navigated the final, critical steps of the counterattack. He moved, his shadow falling over her, and gently began to massage the tense muscles in her shoulders. His touch was firm, knowing, and it sent a jolt of liquid heat through her entire body. She leaned into it, a soft, involuntary sigh escaping her lips. It was a sound of pure exhaustion, but also of yielding. He needed the knots of tension from her neck and shoulders, his thumbs tracing patterns on her skin that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with a long-simmering desire. "You were brilliant tonight," he murmured, his voice a low rumble near her ear. She tilted her head back to look up at him. His face was etched with fatigue, but his eyes were burning with an intensity that stole her breath. The cold, calculating CEO was gone, replaced by a man stripped bare by battle, his emotions raw and unguarded. "We were," she corrected softly, her voice husky. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers, a feather-light touch that was both a question and a promise. She did not pull away. Instead, she rose from her chair, turning to face him and slid her arms around his neck, pulling him down to her. The kiss was not gentle or hesitant. It was a collision, a desperate, hungry claiming that had been building for weeks in stolen glances and late-night debates. It was the taste of whiskey and coffee, of power and surrender, of two formidable wills finally succumbing to a force stronger than either of them. He backed her against the vast glass window, the cold surface a stark contrast to the heat of his body pressing against hers. The rainy cityscape became a glittering, chaotic backdrop to their embrace. His hands tangled in her coiled hair, holding her face for his kiss, while hers roamed the hard plains of his back, feeling the strength and tension in him. This was not just passion. It was a consummation of their partnership, an acknowledgement of the unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of their war. In that moment, he was not her client or her protector. He was her ally, her equal, her other half in a battle for survival. In the quiet aftermath, lying in his bed with the storm abating outside, the city lights painting patterns on the ceiling, the full weight of their new reality settled in. This was no longer a business arrangement. He turned to her, propping himself up on an elbow, and traced the line of her jaw with his finger. The scar on his knuckle was rough against her skin. "I will not let anything happen to you, Lena," he said, his voice thick with a vow that went deeper than any corporate contract. "When this is over, this is not over. You and me, this is permanent." The promise hung in the air, a future she had never dared to imagine. It was a promise of a life of immense power and wealth, a life at the very pinnacle of the city, at the side of a man who looked at her as if she were the center of his universe. But the price of that promise was a life entwined with the Volkov syndicate, a life where danger would always be a shadow at their door. She was about to find out just how high that price was. The next afternoon, the illusion of safety was brutally shattered. Lena decided to get some air, taking one of Adrian's secure vehicles to a small, private gallery she loved. Marco, his head of security, insisted on driving her himself. They were on a quiet street, just a block from the gallery, when a large construction truck suddenly pulled out from a side street, blocking their path. Simultaneously, a black town car screeched to a halt behind them, boxing them in. It was a professional, military-style ambush. Marco's hand immediately went to the weapon holstered beneath his jacket. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice grim. Men in dark clothing emerged from the vehicles, their intentions unambiguous. But before they could act, the world exploded. A third vehicle, a nondescript sedan, slammed into the town car behind them with incredible force, and from it emerged Adrian's men, a swift and brutal counter-ambush. The message was clear. Adrian's surveillance was everywhere. He had anticipated this. But Dimitri's men had not come for a firefight. One of them smashed the rear passenger window where Lena was sitting, the reinforced glass spiderwebbing but holding for a critical second. Through the fractured glass, she saw a man's face, his eyes cold and empty. He wasn't trying to grab her. He was just looking at her, ensuring she saw him, ensuring she felt the terror. It was a message of violation, a promise of what could have been. Then, as Adrian's men descended, they retreated as quickly as they had come, leaving behind a scene of chaos and the lingering scent of fear. Shaken but unharmed, Lena was rushed back to the penthouse. Adrian was waiting, his face a mask of controlled fury so intense it seemed to suck the air from the room. He checked her over with his hands and his eyes, a frantic, desperate search for any injury. When he was satisfied she was physically safe, he pulled her into an embrace so tight it felt like he was trying to merge them into one person, to shield her with his own body. "This is my fault," he rasped into her hair. "I brought you into this." He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his eyes dark with a terrifying resolve. "You are not safe here, not in the city, we're leaving, now." He was not asking, he was telling her. He was taking her to his family's coastal estate, a secluded fortress an hour outside of Cape Town, a place where he could guarantee her safety. As his security team packed a bag for her, and the arrangements were made with cold efficiency, Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the earlier attack. She was being swept away, her autonomy vanishing in the face of his need to protect her. She was surrendering not just her body, but her freedom. Loving Adrian Volkov meant living in his world, by his rules, under his protection. As she was led to a waiting helicopter on the roof of the tower, she looked down at the sprawling city, her city, and realized she was leaving her old life behind for good. The siege was no longer just on the company. It was on her soul, and she had to decide if the man waiting for her inside the roaring aircraft was worth the price of her own independence. The coastal estate was a place of staggering, isolated beauty. Perched on a cliff overlooking the tumultuous Atlantic, the house was a modern masterpiece of stone and glass, designed to both embrace the wild landscape and defend against it. It was surrounded by a high, electrified wall, monitored by state-of-the-art surveillance, and patrolled by a discreet but ever-present security team. It was a sanctuary and a prison, a paradise built on paranoia. For days, Lena felt trapped, packing the vast, sun-drenched rooms like a caged panther. Adrian was a constant, suffocating presence, his focus entirely on her safety. He had delegated the day-to-day running of the company to his most trusted executives, his war room now transferred to a secure office in the heart of the estate. But his primary occupation was Lena. He watched her with a hawk's intensity, his every action screaming a possessive need to keep her shielded from the world that sought to harm her. While a part of her understood, another, fiercely independent part chafed under the relentless protection. She was a strategist, a fighter, not a damsel to be locked in a tower, and the inaction was eroding her spirit. She confronted him one evening on the wide stone terrace as the sun bled into the ocean, painting the sky in violent hues of orange and purple. "This isn't living, Adrian," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "You brought me back to fight a war, not to hide from it. Keeping me here, locked away, you're neutralizing your most valuable weapon." Adrian turned from his watch over the sea, his face hard and uncompromising. "My most valuable weapon is not an asset I am willing to risk," he countered, his voice low and firm. Dmitri showed his hand. "He is no longer playing by corporate rules. He will come for you again, and I will not give him the chance." "So what is your plan?" she shot back, stepping closer to him, her eyes flashing with defiance. "To keep me here forever, to win this war with fists and guns while my mind, the one thing that can actually guarantee your victory, goes to waste." "You don't trust me to handle myself." "Trust you," he said, his voice rising, a rare crack in his icy composure. "I trust you more than I trust anyone on this planet. It is myself I don't trust. If he touches you, if he harms you in any way, I will tear this city apart to find him. I will do things, unleash a part of myself that I have spent my entire life trying to cage, and I may not be able to come back from it. Keeping you safe is as much about protecting you from him as it is about protecting myself from what I would become." His raw, desperate honesty disarmed her. She saw in that moment the terrible weight of his dual nature. He was not just protecting her physically. He was fighting to hold onto the civilized man he had built, the legitimate CEO, and not let the syndicate boss, the heir to a legacy of violence, take over completely. She was his anchor to that better self, and the thought of losing her threatened to sever that anchor for good. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his, her touch a silent message of understanding. "Then let me fight my way," she said softly. "With my mind. Let me build the weapon that will destroy him, not in the shadows, but in the light where everyone can see. A victory so complete, so public that he can never recover. You need to trust me, Adrian, not just to be safe, but to be your partner in this." His thumb stroked the back of her hand, the scar on his knuckle a familiar, rough comfort. He looked from her determined face to the violent beauty of the sunset, a war raging within him. To let her back into the fight was to expose her to risk. To keep her locked away was to lose the very woman he had fallen in love with, the brilliant, defiant strategist who was his equal in every way. He made his choice. He led her to the estate's secure office and gave her unrestricted access to the Volkov Holdings network. "Show me," he said, his voice thick with a combination of fear and absolute faith. "Build your weapon." For the next 72 hours, Lena did not sleep. Fueled by coffee and a burning desire to end the siege on their lives, she worked with a singular, brilliant focus. She did not look for a way to defend against Dmitri. She looked for a way to obliterate him. She dove into the labyrinth of his international finances, peeling back layers of shell corporations and offshore accounts. She used her strategic skills not for logistics, but for forensic accounting, following the dark money, and what she found was more potent than any army. Dmitri Sokolov, for all his posturing about old-world honor, was engaged in massive, blatant financial fraud, propping up his legitimate businesses with money laundered from illicit activities. The final piece of her plan was a gambit of breathtaking audacity. It involved leveraging a series of international financial regulations and public disclosure requirements in a way no one had ever thought to combine them. It would trigger a cascading series of audits and investigations that would not just expose Dmitri, but would legally freeze his assets and cripple his entire operation in a single, devastating blow. The entire strategy would culminate and be triggered at the annual Cape Town Philanthropic Gala, the city's premier social event, which both Adrian and a supremely confident Dmitri were scheduled to attend. It was the perfect stage for his public execution. When she presented the plan to Adrian, he read through the multi-page document in stunned silence. It was a masterpiece of legal and financial warfare, more ruthless and effective than any act of physical violence could ever be. It would dismantle Dmitri's empire, ruin his name, and leave him powerless, all without a single shot being fired. It was a plan that could only have been devised by her, a strategy that used the rules of the legitimate world to deliver a gangster's justice. He looked at her, his eyes filled with an awe that eclipsed all his previous admiration. "This is not just a victory, Lena," he said, his voice hushed. "This is annihilation." She met his gaze, her expression resolute. "He came for our world, Adrian. I'm going to take his." The night of the gala arrived, cloaking the city in a velvet darkness. The grand ballroom of the Cape Monarch Hotel was a sea of glittering jewels and tailored tuxedos. Lena stood beside Adrian, a striking figure in a simple, elegant black gown that clung to her curves, her coiled hair swept up to reveal the strong line of her neck. She felt the eyes of the city's elite upon them, the whispers following them as they moved through the room. They were the ultimate power couple, their story of her firing and spectacular rehiring now the stuff of corporate legend. Across the room, she saw Dmitri Sokolov, smug and victorious, holding court. He believed he had Adrian cornered. He caught Lena's eye and gave a small, mocking smile, a predator who thought his prey was already trapped. He had no idea he was the one walking into the abattoir. At precisely 10 o'clock, as per Lena's instructions, Adrian's legal team in 3 different countries filed the documents she had prepared. At 10:01, a series of anonymous, encrypted data packets were delivered to the top financial journalists in the city. At 10:02, as the chairman of the gala was giving a speech, Dmitri Sokolov's phone began to vibrate violently. Then the phones of his associates. A wave of confusion and panic began to ripple through his circle. His public facade of a legitimate, powerful businessman was crumbling in real time. Adrian led Lena onto the dance floor, pulling her close. They moved together gracefully, the only island of calm in the spreading chaos. It's done, she whispered against his chest, her heart pounding with the thrill of victory. Checkmate. He held her tighter, his lips brushing her temple. You are magnificent. Later, as security was discreetly escorting a pale and ruined Dmitri from the premises, Adrian cornered him near a service exit. There were no syndicate enforcers present, only the two of them. Dmitri looked at him with pure, unadulterated hatred. This was her, he spat. This was not your way. Adrian's expression was cold as Arctic ice. You are right, he said, his voice calm and deadly. I would have just killed you. She gave you a fate worse than death. She left you with nothing. Remember that, every day for the rest of your miserable life, you were beaten not by the Volkov syndicate, but by the woman who owns my world. He left Dmitri there, a ghost in a tuxedo, and returned to Lena, who was waiting for him on the terrace overlooking the glittering harbor. The war was over. They had won. He came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. They stood in silence for a long time, the sounds of the party fading into a distant murmur. This was their city, their future, bought and paid for with her brilliance and his trust. He had been willing to reshape his empire, to choose a new way of fighting for her, and she had accepted him, the syndicate boss and the CEO, and had forged a new kind of power with him. I make you a vow, Lena Hart, he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. No more cages, no more hiding. We build our future together out in the open, as partners. My empire is your empire, my name is your name if you will have it. She turned in his arms, her hazel eyes shining with unshed tears of relief and love. She cupped his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I already have it, she whispered. This was not a fairy tale ending, she knew. The shadows of his world would always linger, but they would face them together, a formidable dynasty built not just on power and wealth, but on a love that had been tested in fire and had emerged unbreakable.